President, we meet at a difficult time, and I thank you again for coming together in this virtual format. I think we all feel very committed to continuing to keep the work of the board going, to maintain the accountability, but also to have the opportunity to seek your guidance, your feedback on how we are progressing. We are meeting in the midst of COVID-19, disruptive, traumatic, disturbing in terms of the outlook for many countries and communities. A great deal of risk has emerged just now that both amplifies previous risks, but also vulnerabilities have become so absolute in this moment. And I think it is difficult to gather quite how far-reaching what is happening around us will be for individual communities, families, but also for development at large. And it reminds me of the fact that, we often hear the term now pre-COVID normal and can we return to it? Well, I think much of what we have learned in the last few weeks has also shown us the Achilles heels of development pathways, of development promises perhaps not fulfilled, and therefore the vulnerability that many countries and economies are experiencing right now, and particularly those who fall outside the established health coverage systems, who do not have access to internet, who therefore are part of the over 1.4 billion children who currently are not at school. The women who are not able to practice their work in terms of livelihoods. I think the list in terms of informal sector livelihoods could go on. It is an extraordinary time, and I begin by reminding ourselves of the magnitude, because it also was to me brought home by the Human Development Report Office's update just a few days ago, which for the first time in 30 years anticipates a reversal in human development. This is unprecedented and just another indicator, if we needed one, that this is not just a momentary crisis, this is a crisis that is shaking the foundations of our economies, societies, but also represents a risk of setbacks and certainly of protracted attempts to recover. And this will influence the way we look at what happens next, which is part of my brief presentation to you this morning. But we also meet at the halfway point of UNDP's strategic plan, and therefore a focus of this meeting at your request was to focus on the midterm review and the progress made. We meet just as the decade of action for sustainable development has begun, and we meet 17 months into the UNDS reform process. And I hope that in the remarks that I will be able to make, and with the encouragement of the president of our board, I will not dwell in detail on the results, because we have provided you with detailed documentation. We have my full speech also available online, which obviously covers in more detail what it is that we have implemented over the 2-year period of the strategic plan. We have the midterm review document that was made available and already has been part of a number of informal board meetings and hopefully is well known to members. Our annual report, which I'm pleased to show you, there is actually a physical version of it as well, but it is online, and try to provide just from last week all of you with an overview of what happened during the past year. And we have also provided you with an update paper on UNDP's contribution and engagement in the UNDS reform process. So these are all givens, and therefore my review of the actual progress will focus on 2 dimensions. One is the results and how we have performed after the midterm review in terms of results. And secondly, on the other part of the strategic plan, which is the transformation of UNDP, its offer, its transformation as an institution, the focus that you asked us to look at, in the areas in which we have invested to look forward. And if you allow me, President, I will immediately proceed into the development results. Just a snapshot. In the video you saw the magnitude of numbers. It does sometimes surprise me in this global context of how many people we can reach, when really the organization is not a major financier of development. But I'm sorry, I just have a little interruption here. Just 1 second, please, President. I just need to turn. My apologies. These are the vagaries when you're operating from a dining table and there is still an entire household operating. So sorry, I continue.
I get it.
You know the feeling, I think everybody can relate to it. And my family has not yet thrown me out, although I have taken occupancy of the dining room and living room for the last, I don't know, 100 and something days. 48 million people had better access to basic services, 28 million voters registered, of whom very reassuringly 48% were women. UNDP actively engaged in supporting countries, over 50 countries, in establishing and reinforcing strong human rights systems. The climate promise exceeding our expectation, with over 110 countries now engaged in working towards, even though the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties is postponed, a review and revision of their nationally determined contributions and national climate strategies. We have seen governance, which has always been at the core of UNDP's work in terms of how countries wish to use UNDP, remain and in fact grow to be the single largest area of investment for UNDP, 40% of our portfolio. But interesting enough, I also want to emphasize, by demand from program countries as much as by demand from those who are financing UNDP's work in terms of the donor community, because 25% of that investment is actually coming from the program countries themselves, and therefore a good indicator of the centrality of this work for us. Our focus on gender, and I won't repeat any numbers, but we have made significant progress and are amongst the best performing UN entities in the UN Women-led SWOP assessment. And I think you will probably have seen in our documents and in our report on gender that we have invested significantly across all aspects of UNDP's work. A gender-balanced senior leadership team, a gender-balanced cohort of resident representatives, a gender-balanced cohort of deputy resident representatives, all this achieved in less than 18 months. And I think a significant step forward, as much as we also are concentrating on the development work of UNDP in terms of gender, reviewing our approaches in both poverty eradication, social protection, and gender-based violence, which obviously in this particular moment has, through the work and the analysis of our sister agencies, UN Women, UNFPA, taken on another central focus. We also work very often as an enabler, and I think the area where this is most obvious is in the vertical funds, where we supported countries to access over 1 billion in vertical funds to tackle climate change and other sustainable development priorities, in addition to which supporting them in leveraging another $1.2 billion in private and public finance across 91 countries. This is a magnitude of what I often say, UNDP and the funding for UNDP is about helping countries to leverage financing and investment. And I think that equation is something we need to document and demonstrate far more clearly. The value of our signature solutions is unlocked by integration. It's a word that has been used and invoked many times. And I continue to say that integration at the end of the day is the difference between trying to tackle issues by sectoral approaches or by accepting that we operate within systems, social systems, economic systems, a government system. And UNDP's approach, for example, is to look at the informal sector, to look at the economy of the poor, to look at exclusion. And these are the kinds of tools where the signature solutions become drivers for integrated responses as opposed to sectoral responses. And it is ultimately mirroring the task of government, whether in the executive, in parliament, or the judiciary, to provide the kind of government institutions that societies are calling for. In terms of our partnership survey, which we just concluded a few months ago, I was very reassured because 80% of partners consider UNDP to be a valuable partner. And I think this is important because this is a survey with over 3,000 respondents. Many of them obviously being hopefully good partners will not say that we're a bad partner, but still it's a critical mass of feedback independently undertaken by a company and carries within it also aspects where we are not performing so well, where partners want to see the instruments of UNDP evolve. You had also asked us to increase the engagement with IFIs, and I'm pleased to report that UNDP and international financial institutions engagement has increased by 50% compared to the previous biennium. And we have also invested heavily in the collaboration with OCHA to strengthen our work in terms of the humanitarian development collaboration. And a good example is how we are collaborating in strengthening resilience in the Lake Chad Basin with our work with WHO and the UN Development System agencies right now. There are so many results. I hope that this is just an indication of, I think, the basic evidence that we provide to you that when you look at the strategic plan and the midterm review in terms of development, results, and delivery, we are on track. But perhaps the more complex and challenging task in the last 2 years was also to drive the transformation of UNDP, of its offer, and its ability to work within the UN development system and indeed the UN family as a whole, under both the objectives of UN reform, but also, and I think principally driven in terms of substance, by where the future of development is evolving. What are the challenges that countries face? What is the role of a development program of the United Nations in the year 2020 or 2025 in terms of being a partner to countries in addressing their development choices and pathways? We have, after a great deal of work, labeled this really the next generation UNDP, next gen UNDP as we refer to it. And it is not just a slogan that emerged overnight. It is driven by the priorities set out in the strategic plan, but brought to life by a very deliberate set of intensive re-engineering efforts within UNDP and with our partners to push, as we said in last year's report, the boundaries of how we think, how we deliver, how we invest, and how we manage. And I think the one reassuring aspect in an otherwise very traumatizing period has been to see how these investments in the response that UNDP was able to mobilize immediately when COVID-19 hit us has been evidence of some of the value already being realized of these investments. We have gone through an intense period of UN reform, and yet we're able to establish UNDP's financial stability, always a challenge. But you will remember that at the beginning of this strategic planning period, we had significantly drawn down on the reserves because of deficits. The last 2 years have been without deficit, and we have taken many steps to make UNDP nimbler and more responsive, more efficient, and more effective. And the latest numbers where we are able to spend 91 cents in the dollar on programs, up from 88 in 2018, is yet another illustration of how these efforts are beginning to pay off. But we have invested also significantly in transforming that development offer. The investment in the accelerator lab networks that in less than 8 months, we stood up in 60 countries, covering in fact 78 countries. UNDP's creativity has been enhanced in sourcing local solutions to tackle the complexity of development far more from within countries, from within the ingenuity of both innovation in government, but also innovation in the private sector, in startup communities, and with institutions within the country and communities. We have invested heavily in transforming the knowledge functions of UNDP through the establishment of the Global Policy Network as a driving concept, whereby we now try to connect remotely the 8,800 specialists across the organization. And indeed, it has become a magnet for 5,000 other experts who we often work with and who are part of this Global Policy Network. We are investing significantly and deliberately in making UNDP an institution that in the future can access best practice, knowledge, and expertise across its entire organization in real time in order to make that value of UNDP as a development learning network and resource of best practices available to every country. Our investments in a digital UNDP have been significant. It's perhaps the most forward-looking investment we make in terms of driving UNDP into the frontier of where digital possibilities emerge, both as an organization operationally, but also in terms of digitalization in development. And I think we have seen just in the last few weeks the extraordinary spectacle of the future of digitalization literally being brought forward by 5 or 10 years in many country contexts, in many institutional contexts. And UNDP has been very much at the center of helping countries to leverage and also to take advantage of these opportunities. We invested in a new People for 2030 strategy, our human resource development strategy, because the people that UNDP is able to attract, to retain, but also how we develop their skills, how we evolve their capacity to be at the frontier of development thinking is critical. And that strategy is now in full implementation on 9 tracks. We just also approved an IT investment strategy because equally UNDP's IT infrastructure its ERP with which it manages itself are critical components of a modern, efficient, effective, and transparent organization, and yet another major investment in transforming UNDP. But these are sort of some of the more inward-looking parts to make UNDP be an institution that rises to the objectives of the strategic plan. But there are also examples such as the newly conceived Human Development Report focus. Under the leadership of our colleague Pedro Conceição, the Human Development Report Office published in 2019 what has been a widely recognized significant report on inequality. And as you probably recall, this theme will be part of a trilogy for 3 years, but with different other elements being introduced. And this year, we will focus on the link of inequality and nature and environment sustainability, because in fact, that relationship is at the heart also of the 2030 agenda and the future of many economies. We invested in a new crisis bureau. We are invested heavily as an organization in fragile and crisis affected countries. 9 of our 10 largest programs today are in fact in those countries. And UNDP continues to be the principal provider of support and partnership to the Peace Building Fund and also to the Office for Counterterrorism in terms of preventing violent extremism. It speaks to the synergy and the strength of UNDP's presence on the ground. Finally, just another indication of the transformation in the context of the UN development system with the delinking of the Resident Coordinator's Office, the establishment of DCO. There is still a significant reliance on providing services to this infrastructure. And I'm pleased to report that UNDP in a rating received a 73% satisfied rating from UNDP's support to RCs. That was part of our partnership survey, so the larger population watching us. But we also introduced something that many of you may be familiar with from using an Uber, which is a rating system of every single service action. As you commission UNDP to undertake a service action, you can provide a rating. Over the last 17 months, we have received 19,000 service requests, and the RC system as a user has rated UNDP on average at 4.24 out of 5 stars, just as another evidence that in this transition, much of what was necessary to keep the RC offices moving forward has actually been working quite well. President, let me move my focus to the steps that will follow. Clearly in the MTR, we identified a number of areas that need more attention, and I will not take your time this morning in detail, but from the beginning, I was keen that this strategic plan will be judged by whether it was reform ready, because we had to approve it, as you recall, before the reform resolution was passed in the General Assembly, and future focused. I think on these 2 fronts, we have made significant progress, but as always, we still are identifying areas where we are struggling perhaps to make progress fast enough, or we are still trying to discover how an institution like UNDP can move forward. We had a significant discussion with you around poverty eradication based on an evaluation, and I'm very proud of our independent evaluation office because it is an integral part of enabling you and us to look at where we need to evolve. I think our dialogue with you was a good example of how we are now investing and strengthening our focus on multidimensional poverty and reorienting our approach also to social protection, which clearly has emerged not only with COVID, but in fact in the lead up to COVID already as key areas of priority. We have, as I mentioned, invested significantly in the global policy network, but we are still struggling on how to make this work in an organization that is 89% project-based funding. So our expertise is not fungible in the sense that you can take the best person on social protection from one country and make them available to another team, because we need to find ways in which we can use that expertise while not breaking our commitments and contractual obligations. So we have had some delays in moving forward what is essentially a new digital platform internally in UNDP to use those 8,800 experts. We are engaged in heavy efforts to cluster services also, and again, the rules within the UN in terms of staffing rules, contractual rules, have slowed us down on some fronts, but actually I must commend also our staff because they have been incredibly willing to buy into this transformation of the organization, and we have foreshadowed and envisaged significant cost reductions as a result of these investments. President, let me end by just drawing let's say, a couple of conclusions out of what we observe, both from the MTR that I've tried to briefly present to you in the strategic plan and our performance, and the moment in time in which we find ourselves, the here and now. This is a COVID-19 moment, and there is no doubt that it will shape what we will have to respond to in the next or the remaining period of the strategic plan. But I'm convinced that in the way that our UNDP COVID-19 offer that we launched in March and that immediately responded to a quick capacity to assist countries, over 100 were reached in less than 8 weeks with specific grants that we released, allows us also to draw attention to the integration function of UNDP, the Build Back Better priority that everybody is invoking. And therefore, as I look forward to the next few months, I believe that we are one of the institutions that must be at the heart of both adjusting to the COVID-19 challenge of our countries with whom we work, but also be an anchor that maintains the compass of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs firmly on the radar of countries, but also the international community. And I would suggest that 4 areas based on the demand that we have identified in the last 3 months have emerged around which I think much of what we do can be very well captured. One is clearly governance, the role of the state vis-à-vis its citizens, the markets, the private sector, the ability of maintaining business continuity in government, but also the rule of law, human rights in the midst of these very turmoil-like situations, economic recovery strategies that can navigate the dilemmas that countries now face in terms of the mitigation measures, saving corporate entities from going bankrupt, investing in mitigation measures, cash transfer programs for informal sector workers who no longer have the ability to earn a living. This is a complex moment in which governments have to make terrible choices, if you want, and are faced with enormous fiscal constraints. We are in the midst of also deploying the integrated national financing framework support, which again, in over 50 countries in the next few months, will assist countries in actually trying to address these issues from the perspective of the choices governments must make. And here, let me make a reference to the Secretary General's request for UNDP to take the technical lead role within the UN country teams and with the resident coordinator in the socioeconomic response that we are supporting. I mentioned yesterday briefly, already in 63 countries, the first products have been prepared with UN country teams, with our counterpart governments. There are also 5 initial socioeconomic assessments on a regional basis. We are working with the whole UN family, with DCO and the resident coordinators who have the lead role in terms of COVID-19 response. And I hope that this will be a significant contribution, both to having a joined up response of the UN family, but also very much supporting governments in their choices. The second major area, social protection and uprooting inequalities. We clearly have to assist governments right now and for the foreseeable future in addressing the cash transfer programs, identifying the vulnerable, gender disaggregated data, disability, rural, urban. How are we able to support governments in putting the kind of social mitigation measures, social safety nets, but also programs in place that address gender-based violence, drive forward the digital reach of temporary basic incomes, universal basic incomes perhaps as one of the outcomes that countries will wish to consider. And how do we also bring into the national debate the Build Back Better view of what could happen next, the future of work, the future of digital connectivity in education, in business, and the role of, again, the private sector with governments acting here. We are working very closely with a number of agencies, ILO, UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, United Nations Volunteers, the United Nations Capital Development Fund, precisely in looking at how UNDP can ideally provide the expertise and also help leverage the UN collective expertise to assist countries. The third area, green economy. There is no question that wherever you look in the world right now, governments are looking for opportunities to invest in a more resilient, more sustainable, more low carbon future economy. I think UNDP's significant portfolio in this area provides an excellent foundation upon which we can work with UNEP, with FAO, with DESA, and also the international financial institutions in addressing the designing and de-risking of nature-based solutions, agriculture and food systems with FAO, because this is part of the NDC work that we're already doing with FAO, climate change, investments in energy, drawing also on the analysis and the partnership that we have developed with IRENA in terms of helping countries to access investment, but also develop their renewable energy strategies. And finally, the fourth area along governance, social protection, and green economy will be digital disruption and innovation. This is both an opportunity, and we all know that in just a few weeks, countries have had to scramble across the world to be able to take advantage of the possibilities, but also to address perhaps the deficits in not having invested sufficiently in it. School children out of education, health systems functioning, governments being able to operate. For instance, in these first few weeks, over 40 governments requested UNDP support to keeping their public services going as the pandemic began. This has to do with health centers, central government, local government, Zoom licenses for parliament committees to meet to authorize budgets, cabinets, and situation rooms in the executive. It is a fascinating spread and scope of activity, but it is also about trying to understand how not only we get children back into education, how we may be able to connect schools. And here I want to mention UNICEF also with their GIGA initiative. We are partnering with UNICEF very much and UNESCO in this effort to understand, could $100 billion be a shortcut to connecting virtually all schools to the internet in the next couple of years, to both address the extraordinarily painful situation of children who are simply out of education now, but also the future of education. And at the same time, there are also issues of privacy, of human rights that are arising in this very rapid spread of internet access and the use of digital information, of tracing and tracking. These are all areas that intersect with governance, with social protection, and speak again to UNDP's core DNA of being an integrator, being able to connect these different spheres. President, I end by just quoting Amartya Sen, who inspired the Human Development Report and whose thinking and teachings, I think, remain so relevant to our appreciation of human development, of human security, and the future of development. And he said, while we cannot live without history, we need not live within it either. And that is very much the mantra that I hope we as UNDP can, as part of the UN system, bring to this extraordinary moment, but also with a strong view and commitment to maintaining a focus on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. We were not a healthy set of global societies and economies before the pandemic. The pandemic has amplified, has reminded us of our Achilles heels. I think in the future of development, in the SDGs, lie much of what countries will hold on to as they chart their way forward. And my last remark is simply to thank you, President, the Bureau, the board members, our partners, our funders, and our sister agencies, as well as my staff. At this moment, with all of you, with all of them, and with the teams of UNDP fully deployed across the world, we are part of what multilateralism stands for and what the United Nations, I hope, will be recognized and remembered for in this moment of crisis. Thank you.